Thank you. It's 6:35. We want to start. We want to welcome each one of you. Thank you for joining us for our third day of our training. It is a privilege to have you with us and to see the familiar names that have joined in through the 2 days. And so we would like to welcome you on behalf of the Secretariat and President's Department. And the officers, we want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. I will ask, let's see, Busani Kumede, if you can open in prayer for us, if you are able to. Seems like, okay, go ahead.
Okay, asikhulekeni Baba Nkosengcwele, Mdali wezulu nomhlaba, siyabonga ntambama uphindile futhi wasibizela ezifundweni eziqhubekayo. Sicela kube nathi futhi silizwe izwi lakho likhuluma nathi, usihlakaniphise ukuze sikwazi ukuphatha ibandla lakho ngendlela efanele. Yiba-ke nomfundisi osiphathela iy'fundo akhulume amazwi akho. Ekupheleni kwazo zonke ley'fundo bese-ke ibandla lakho siliphatha ngendlela leyo ehlelekile, wena ophethe ibandla lakho ezulwini nasemhlabeni. Senzele-ke ngoJesu siyakhuleka. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Gumede. We appreciate the prayer. And once again, for those that have joined, we want to welcome you to our third day of our governance training. Just an announcement, last night's presentation, we are still sorting some technical glitches. We will share that tomorrow together with the summarized version or the presentation with each one of you tomorrow. It will be sent to the leaders WhatsApp group and the elders group as well. So we apologize for any inconvenience, but it will be shared tomorrow. It is my privilege again to welcome our speaker for this week, Professor Gwala. He has shared 2 presentations thus far, and I'm sure each one of you has been richly blessed and also educated to a certain degree on the governance of our church and how we run meetings, etc. Especially yesterday's presentations on meeting procedures. It seems like Dr. Kuala is a parliamentarian of note. And so we want to thank him for that. And welcome, Dr. Gwala. May God bless you as you continue to serve us as KNFC. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much, my president. It has been a good time together. We started on Sunday. We started with us knowing who we are and our DNA as Adventists. And then we went to the second day where we were now talking about meeting and meeting procedures. Today we are talking about policy development, policy review, and the implementation and interpretation of policy. That's where we are today. As you might have known or seen yesterday, I am trying to break down difficult concepts so that as a lay member, you are able to understand, grapple with these concepts, and be able to be fruitful in your very own church. I am preparing you to be able to lead efficiently and effectively. And I'm also preparing you when you are chosen to go to a session, you are not blank on how things are going to be done. Therefore, these things are actually assisting you and preparing you to have meaning in the kind of work you are doing. This time I'm going to begin, and my topic for discussion today is policy development and policy interpretation. As I start the presentation this evening, I'm going to start by defining what a policy is so that we understand when we talk about policy, what are we talking about? The first thing that we do is to define. Policy is a formally adopted principle or rule that guides decisions, that guides actions, and that guide procedures within an organization. Therefore, there are three important things that have been highlighted. A policy guides decisions, a policy guides actions, and a policy guides processes and procedures in an organization. Therefore, that's the definition of policy. What does that mean? It means policy provides direction and consistency in decision making. It means it establishes boundaries and standards of conduct. It means it reflects values and objectives of the organization. All these are actually seen in the policy. Policy serves as a framework for procedures and implementation. That's what is important when we talk about policy. It's a guiding rule, a guiding principle that has been agreed upon, which would help decisions, actions, and procedures. Therefore, that's what a policy is in simple terms. Let's leave the policy. Let's look at few things related to the decision we have given now. Now, every policy that you see out there, it is characterized by the following. What needs to be done? When there's a policy stipulates what should be done. And secondly, the policy stipulates the circumstances of when that should be done. For an example, let's say for argument's sake, a member divorces his or her spouse. Now, once you divorce your spouse, there is a policy that kicks in, and that policy says if you have divorced, you must apply for clearance. Therefore, you can see the circumstances under which that policy is implemented. Therefore, policy would indicate what should be done, and policy would indicate the circumstances under which that you are going to do should be done. Right? And then the same policy would do three important things. Firstly, it would establish the rights of an individual who is subjected to that very same policy. It would also have requirements from the individual as well as the implementer of the policy. And it will also have responsibilities from the person who's affected and the person who's implementing the policy. Therefore, there are three things that you must always remember when there is a policy and the policy needs to be implemented. That there are rights that you need to look at, and there are requirements that you need to look at if they are met. There are responsibilities that you must look at when you are looking at a policy, as we are discussing this evening. Let me take you through the governance documents in the Seventh-day Adventist Church so that you understand when we talk about governance documents, what are we talking about? We are talking about a number of documents that are there. We are talking about the fundamental beliefs. Now, those of you who have been long in the church would know that in the Adventist Church, at the beginning of our organization, there was a debate whether we should have a statement of fundamental beliefs or an apostolic creed. And our forefathers or our pioneers then decided that we should have a statement of fundamental belief. Now, the statement of fundamental belief, its importance is that it incorporates within itself what we call progressive revelation. In other words, as knowledge increases, as God reveals more things from the scripture to us, we are able to review, we are able to add, we are able to, to remove some of the foundational beliefs, because it's a statement of fundamental beliefs that is based on progressive revelation, as opposed to an apostolic creed. An apostolic creed does not change. It was apostolic creed 100 years ago, and it was done the very same way it's done even today. It does not incorporate progressive revelation. An apostolic creed remains the same. All right. Therefore, that's very important. The issue of the fundamentals. Your fundamental beliefs are a governing document that govern our doctrinal purity, our doctrinal information and knowledge, and our doctrinal heritage. Very important. That's document number one. Document number two, it's policies, which I want us to also look at. Now, in the Adventist Church, you have policies that have been developed in all 4-tier structures. The General Conference developed policies, and when it has developed them, they are called working policies. The division develops policies, and those policies are actually linked to the GC policies, and those policies are also called working policies. Then the union develops policies which are in line with the division and the GC, and those policies, once again, they are called working policies. Now, some conferences have developed policies. I know for a fact that KwaZulu-Natal is one of those conferences. By the way, we need to pat you at the back and say, you are the very first conference in the entire union that has an approved a set of policies in its policy book. And I want to applaud you for that. And particularly because when those policies were put in place, I'm one of those that were consulted, because the person who was spearheading that was my student. And therefore, I'm very grateful that he did that and made KwaZulu-Natal to be the very first conference to actually establish policies that are locally addressing matters in the conference. Therefore, you have working policies that go through. Now, the KwaZulu-Natal policy is not a working policy. It's a policy for the conference, which is a good thing that they have. Now, then you go to the local churches. Local churches, through their business meetings, they can actually establish they can establish policies, all right? Policies on how to use their church buildings, policies on how to regulate members who are preaching outside their churches, policies that would regulate how they are going to set their budgets. There are so many policies that we can create in the local church which are not against or which are not inconsistent with the policies that the conference, the GC, and others have. Now, that's very important. I wanted you to know that. Then the local church has actually a guiding document which is called church manual, right? That church manual is voted at the general conference level. And that church manual, you would notice that it's divided into two major sections. You have your obligatory sections and you have your discretionary sections. I'm going to talk about it later on, right? Therefore, this is very important, your policies in the church. Then the third one is the constitutions. As you all know, that in the local church, we do not have constitutions. Constitutions start at the conference level. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that in the thinking of an Adventist church, a local church does not have a locus standi. It does not have a legal standing in simple terms. But I also want you to know that even though our governance documents are saying the local church does not have a locus standi, you would notice that when the time for merger took place, there was a time when one church in the Cape Conference, the old Cape Conference, litigated against the union, all right, because of the decision that was taken to merge the conferences. Now, where the union went to the court, saying to the court, the local church does not have a locus standi. Therefore, they don't have a jurisdiction to litigate. But the court in Bloemfontein took an action that made a decision, a ruling. And the ruling was that church at Hermanus, it was Hermanus Church. That church at Hermanus has a locus standi. Therefore, the church can litigate. Now, I want you to understand that there is a case law that the church can litigate or the church has a locus standi, but our documents in the church are all indicating that a local church does not have a locus standi. Therefore, there is you can see that there is a tension between the law and our books, our governance documents. But let's leave it that. Let's leave that one. I think it's the baby of the union to sort it out. But I needed to explain to you the issue of locus standi as reflected in the constitutions. Sorry. And then the last one, it's your official statements of the church. You find these in the General Conference website. Now, every issue that troubles a member, an Adventist, or the surroundings where we are, the church has always had statements that are official, that are dealing with those. And those are considered policy documents or governance documents. Therefore, in the Adventist church, you have these 4 governance documents. Let me repeat them. The first one is fundamental beliefs. The second one, it's your policies. The third one, it's constitutions. And the fourth one, it's your official statements. These are your governance documents in the Adventist church. Right, let's quickly look at these documents again so that you see them, all right? From GC right through to the union, their policies are actually called working policies. They are relating a relationship between the employer and the employee. Therefore, they are dealing with those items. They are dealing with the organization, the understanding of the of leadership and administration in the organization, and they are also dealing with issues of sub-organizations within the organization. Therefore, that is covered in your working policy. From working policy, in your local church, you have a church manual. Remember, from conference up to general conference, those 3 spheres of government, they are using working policy. Then your local church is using what we call a church manual. Very important here. Then you would have executive committees or you would have business meetings that would, or you even have sessions that would make policy decisions, all right, which are going to be assisting us. You know, there's one thing I need to say here, which my church, the Adventist church, does not follow through. When the General Conference makes a decision, let's say for argument's sake, remember we have a representative form of governance. When a general conference makes a decision at session, it is the highest body that makes decisions. Now, that decision, it is supposed to be to cascade down to the union session. At the union session, that decision is supposed to be acknowledged or noted, so that everyone under the union understands that there is a decision that was taken at the general conference, and that decision is affecting us. And at the conference level, when they have a session, all the decisions that have been made by the general conference are shared with the constituency, and the constituency notes them, because we cannot vote against them because they have been voted or done at a higher level where we had a representation. But the challenge now, I'm gonna be frank here. One of the issues why the women ordination has not died yet, particularly with your deaconesses as well as your elders, it is because the decision that was made at the general conference did not cascade to the union, and the union acknowledges it. And then it did not cascade from the union to the local conferences to acknowledge it, so that the local conferences, when they go back to their churches, the elders and the delegates that were there, they are able to report that these are the decisions that were made at the general conference. And those decisions, we have noted them for implementation at our level. Therefore, that's a challenge. That is that there is a gap between policies that have been made and created and the implementers at the grassroots level, because information does not cascade down through the 4-tier structures that we have, right? Then you would have then the official statements, which I've already mentioned and spoke about. Let me at this time look at what are the policy basic fundamental criteria. When you are looking at policy, what are those? What is the criteria? You have two important things that I want you to consider. The first one, you are clarifying the expectations of a member in this organization. What must I expect? Therefore, the policy needs to clarify that expectation, right? Very important. I've mentioned that the intent, it states the intent and the purpose behind the expectations, right? It provides unambiguous guidance for conduct and decision making. That's what the policy does. It deals with your expectations as a member of a particular organization. The second one, the policy is looking at legal and organizational soundness. All right, very important. That's the criteria. Is this policy sound? Is this policy meeting legal requirements? We're in South Africa, and our constitution says the South African constitution is the supreme it's the supreme rule in South Africa. Therefore, our policies aligned so that we don't have policies that are mitigating against the country. If they are not, then we always have an opportunity to present requests for amendments of the Constitution, because the Constitution has been amended a number of times. And therefore, we still as a country have a request to do so if we see that there are policies or there are laws that are militating against us as people that are staying in that country. Therefore, legal scrutiny is very important in a policy form. All right. Can the policy withstand legal scrutiny? Is the policy protecting the organization against litigation? Can the policy adequately defend the organization's rights and interests? Therefore, these are two important areas when we talk about policy criteria, basic criteria. The question that comes to your mind might be, we have policies, Mfundis, already. You've told us. Is there a need for a policy? Do we really need a policy? You know, when I was teaching at Helderberg College, there would come students and they would ask, "Hey, I came here to study the Bible. Why are we doing African studies? Why are we doing computers? Why are we doing English? We came here to study the Bible." Now, remember, you came to study the Bible, but you will be taken to a community that does not speak isiZulu. How are you going to communicate there? Therefore, they are helping you to be able to speak English. You are now going to be using soft sources or information in a soft copy format. How are you going to access that if you did not go through that? Therefore, in as much as you are here to worship a church, but you need a policy to guide, how are you going to worship with other people, right? Therefore, is there a need of a policy? That's the question probably that you are asking. Now, when you ask that question, you need to understand the following. The issue affects many people or departments. If there is an issue that affects many people, you do need something to regulate that issue. You know there's an issue and that issue is not regulated. Therefore, you create a policy that is going to regulate that issue. Two, there is a potential legal risk and you don't have a policy that deals with that. Therefore, that immediately tells you there's a need for a policy. Three, consistency is required. We deal with this issue this way. Next time it comes, we deal with it that way. Next time this way. And people are beginning to label us as people who are favoring individuals and people who are not sticking to one way of doing things, preferential treatment. All right. Therefore, once you are not doing things consistently, you then need a policy. Then decisions are recurring in nature, and there is nothing that guides you to make those decisions. Therefore, you need a policy. The matter relates to governance, ethics, finance, or safety, but you don't have a policy how those things can be done. Therefore, policy becomes important, very key. If a matter is temporary, is minor, or procedural, it may require a procedure or a guideline, not a formal policy. Remember this: temporary, minor, just a procedural issue. You might need a procedure, not necessarily a policy. Or you might need a guideline, not necessarily a policy. Remember, those are two different things, very important. Let's leave that one and look at the purpose of policy in an organization, right? I'm going to share a number of them. The first one is that the purpose of a policy in an organization is to provide structured guidance for consistency, structured guidance for lawfulness, structured guidance for mission-aligned decision-making, right? Therefore, you have three important things: consistency, lawfulness, and decision-making that are mission-aligned. That's the purpose of the policy, first purpose. Then you have a second purpose of the policy. The second purpose is that your policy guides, provides direction, all right? Therefore, we know that we are going from point A to point B because there is a policy that is telling us how we are going to reach point B and how we are going to handle the road to point B. Therefore, it provides direction. The second important thing is it ensures consistency because we were not consistent in the past. Then the third one, it protects the organization, it reduces legal risk and safeguard institutional integrity. Then the fourth one is it promotes accountability. It defines responsibilities and standards of conduct. The fifth one, it supports strategic goals. It aligns operations with the organization's mission and vision. That's the value and the importance of policy. In essence, a policy exists to create order, it exists to create fairness, it exists to create stability and protection within the organization. Therefore, it's very important to understand the role of policy. Let's quickly look at the process of policy development. The first thing that you look at is identify the issue or the problem to be addressed. You cannot just, policies are always created because there is a vacuum. There is something they need to address. You don't just create a policy out of the blue. Therefore, you want to address something, but there's a vacuum. You can't address it because you don't have a policy. Or you have policies, but those policies are not relevant to what you are about to address. Very important. Therefore, you identify the issue or the problem. How? Policies are developed to address real life issues which affect members at church. All right. Once there are issues that draws attention to them, therefore we need to create a policy that is going to deal with those. Then the policy assesses whether existing policy is sufficient to address the issue or the problem. Therefore, there are two things that you are looking at. The first one, you identify the problem. And once you have identified the problem, you ask the question, do we have a policy to deal with this? No, we don't. Do we have other policies that can relate to this problem? We may have them, but they will not assist us to address this adequately, right? Then after you have assessed, then you come to a decision that there's a need for a policy or there's no need for a policy. Remember, you may need a policy or you may just need just a guideline, not necessarily a policy that you're going to be dealing with, right? Let's quickly look at the process of policy development. It will help us as we move on. Before we can embark on developing a policy, we need to look at the following. We need to check whether or not the existing policies address the issue at hand. Secondly, we need to check whether or not existing policy are leaving a gap or gaps when the issue at hand is addressed. In other words, the first thing is no policy. The second one is there are policies. Are they addressing the issue? No. Are they leaving gaps in addressing the issue? Yes, they are. And then thirdly, we check whether or not policy still meets the goal or objectives. In other words, if it doesn't meet the goals, why it was put in place. If it doesn't meet the objectives, why it was put in place. Therefore, what is important is that policy needs to be taken for a review, because you cannot have a policy that is there and not addressing the reason why it was put in place. Therefore, once the policy becomes irrelevant, it forces us to take us for a review so that it's able to address issues that come up for attention. Right, let's continue with the process. Now, let's say now you decide if a new policy is needed. You now decide. Now, what then happens is the prevailing situation, it is that situation that will dictate whether you need a new policy or not. Because you have picked up, you don't have a policy, you have picked up the policies that are there are leaving a gap. Therefore, do I need a new policy or not? Therefore, the situation will determine, is it a policy that is needed or is it just a guideline? The situation will determine that. That's the first thing. Now, secondly, identify the benefits that would be brought about by a new policy. We don't have a policy now. What are the disadvantages? What are the challenges that we have? When we bring a new policy, what are the benefits that members are going to get? How is it going to protect us? Therefore, all those things must be reflected in your thinking when you think of having a new policy in place. Right, let's quickly look at steps taken. Now, the first step that you are taking when you are developing a policy is consultation with the appropriate stakeholders or structures, right? When crafting a new policy, you cannot craft it on your own. Remember, there are stakeholders that are going to be affected here. I'm going to give you an example. We are now creating a policy on strategic planning. Now, when we create that policy in the local church, the first persons that must be consulted, it's your leadership core. Your leadership core is your pastor, your elders, your secretariat, and your treasury. That leadership core. Therefore, that's the first people that you are going to approach if you are asked to look at a new policy as a subcommittee. Therefore, you approach those people. Once you've approached those people, you now go to the departments who are now going to implement the plan when it has been approved. Take them through, get them their concerns, and get them to input into your development of the policy. Then from there, you go to the members, because members are recipients of the policy that is going to be implemented. Therefore, they are stakeholders in your policy in your policy development. Then once you are done with your members, you then go to the conference, because the policy that you are developing in the local church must be in line with all the policies of the church. Therefore, you cannot leave the conference behind. Who are you consulting at the conference level? You are consulting the executive secretary, is the person to be consulted. Therefore, can you see that there's a policy we want to develop, and that policy we consult the stakeholders, which would include the conference at this time. What is the reason for doing all this? The reason is to ensure the policy reflects real operational capacity, and that the policy gets strategic direction. Very important to understand those elements. Let's quickly look at the process again. Now, when I write the new policies, how must I word the policy statement? Very important. We have established that there is a need. We have now done the consultations, and we are now at the stage where we are writing the policy. Now, how are we supposed to write it? Or what must we consider when we write the policy statement? The first one is we need to use clear and simple language. We need to avoid legal jargon and complicated terminology. That's the first thing. The second one is we must always remember that a policy is not a law. It should not be written in legalese or overly technical language. Thirdly, we should be aware that the policy should be concise and direct, state the intent and the expectations clearly in the policy. Then the fourth one is write for a diverse audience. Remember, in the Adventist church, you do not have one culture. You have a number of cultures that are there. When you develop a policy, don't develop a policy based on a particular culture that is there in the church, because tomorrow and other cultures will be added, and that policy will be redundant. It will be ineffective because you have not considered the diverse audience that you have. And then focus on purpose and guidance. Remember, a policy should provide direction. It should not create confusion. When a policy creates confusion, then it means there is a problem somewhere. Use positive and constructive wording. All right. In other words, emphasize what should be done rather than only what is prohibited, because you are actually making the policy positive and constructive. Now, I'm going to share an example with you. All right. The first example is, we said the policy is not a legal document. It should not use a legalese language, right? Now, let's look at this, and I want to read it for you. It says, members should be obligated to comply with the aforementioned stipulations herein. All right? Members shall be obligated to comply with the aforementioned stipulations herein. I'm looking at a church in KwaNongoma, and then you write this in your policy. I wonder how many people would really understand what you are trying to put across. Therefore, that's the challenge. That's why I'm saying there it's a cross. You cannot write this in a policy statement. What is it that you can write in a policy statement? This is what you can write. All members are expected to follow this policy at all times. Would there be any person who may not understand that? Everyone will be in a position to know what is it that you're talking about. Therefore, the choice of the language is very important. What is the bottom line here? The bottom line here is a good policy statement is clear. A good policy statement is understandable. A good policy statement is practical and accessible to everyone in the organization. Very key, very important. Let's quickly now look at the rules of writing a policy, right? They are going to help us as we go along. Now, the first rule is, when you write a policy, keep it simple. The second rule is, select words carefully when you write a policy. The third one is, use fewer words when you write a policy. The fourth rule is, keep it general but clear. Like we said, you have a diverse audience. Therefore, your policy needs to be general. Number 5, keep it helpful. Don't have a policy that is there for the sake of having it. Keep a policy useful. Right? I'm going to give you an example of this. I'll choose one of them and give you an example so that you follow. Now, I'm saying the first example is, I've written there, it's a complicated one. Members won't understand this. This is the example. All congregants are hereby required to demonstrate compliance with established ecclesiastical decorum during liturgical proceedings. Very nice English and very relevant, but it speaks to a certain community. It speaks to a certain sector of your congregations. Therefore, this cannot be something that will be used, because you are going to lose many members, and yet the policy must be accessible to them. If it can't be accessible to them, therefore it's not a policy, because a policy is helping them as members. Therefore, this would not help them. What can help them? Here is a statement. All members are expected to behave respectfully during church service. Is there anyone who can't understand this? No one. Everyone will understand this. You've put it simple, and it meets the requirements, and it conveys clearly what you want to curb in the community. Very important. Right, let's leave this and then go to the rules for policy interpretation. We've talked about policy development. We're now talking about policy interpretation. Very important. Now, the first rule that is there for interpreting policy, it is called the literal rule, right? I want you to look at what is involved in the literal rule. This rule requires the interpreter to interpret the policy based on its written words. All right. Therefore, the person who's looking at the policy is looking at words in the policy, word for word, and the implementation will come from those words. All right. The general argument under this rule is that a policy means exactly what it says and should be interpreted and applied exactly as it reads. I'm going to give you an example so that I don't lose you in the process. Here is the example. This is the policy statement. Church board meetings will be held on the first Sunday of every month at 10 o'clock a.m., right? That's a policy statement of your church, right? Now, arising from that policy statement, this would be the interpretation and the implementation of the statement. Look at it here. Using the literal rule, the policy is interpreted exactly as it is written. How? I'm going to give you first things. The meeting must take place on the first Sunday, not the second Sunday, not the last Sunday, not the third Sunday. The policy says first Sunday. Therefore, literally, it must be the first Sunday. That's point number one. Point number two, the policy says at 10 o'clock. It cannot be when we meet again, we say we meet at 12. When we meet again, we say we meet at 2. No, we must meet at 10 because the policy says 10 o'clock, right? Then the third one is if the first Sunday falls on a public holiday and people would like to leave and be with their families, they can't because the policy says meet on the first Sunday. Therefore, the literal rule says you must do it on that particular time. That's the way your your policy could be interpreted literally. Therefore, this is the first type of a policy, of a rule that we use when we interpret policy. It is called the literal rule. Let's leave the literal rule and see what would happen. Now, under this, the literal rule, the interpreter does not read additional meaning into the policy. All right? The wording is applied strictly according to its plain and ordinary meaning in this rule. Let's leave this rule and come to the second rule. The second rule, it's called the rule of context. The first one was the literal rule. All right, this one is the rule of context. What is happening here? According to this rule, a policy should be read and interpreted in the spirit and context in which it was made. Very, very important. The spirit and context in which it was made. Therefore, here you interpret in the spirit. Very important. Therefore, in other words, the interpreter should endeavor to see the policy through the eyes and the spirit of those who wrote it. Here is an example that I want to share with you. Example is, policy statement is, members must maintain silence during church services. That's the statement, right? Now, how do we interpret that statement? Now, when we interpret that statement, we are saying this does not mean absolute silence at all times. It promotes reverence and it avoids unnecessary distractions. Not participating in singing, prayer, or appropriate responses are not necessarily included here. For instance, if the policy says silence, there shouldn't be any singing. There shouldn't be any prayer. There shouldn't be any amens when someone is preaching. But because the policy is interpreted using the rule of context, all right? The rule of context is people must be silent, but within that silence, we allow singing. We allow this, we allow that. But in the literal rule, we shouldn't be allowing it because literally it says no one must do anything. They must not even be preaching. They must be silent. But with the rule of context, we are saying silence is there, it's important, but there are pockets of things that can be done within the service which are not necessarily having tension or colliding with the concept of silence. Right, the key point here, when you interpret the policy by considering its purpose and intention, not just the words in isolation. That's what is important here. You interpret the policy by considering its purpose and intention, right? Very important. Therefore, here we deal with the rule of context. We look at the context and we say silence in this context means this. Let's leave that one and go to the third rule. The third rule is called the rule of interpreting ambiguity. It's called contra proferendum. All right? The rule of interpreting ambiguity. Now here, there are a few things I want you to note, very important. According to this rule, a policy is ambiguous when it is susceptible to more than one reasonable interpretation. In other words, this rule says that when the meaning of the policy or term is ambiguous, the interpretation should be in favor of the member and not the policy maker and implementer. I've also given an example here so that I'm not leaving you not following this rule of interpreting ambiguity. Here is the rule. Members, this is the policy, members who arrive late may not participate in the service. All right? Members who arrive late may not participate in the service. Now here, immediately you have ambiguity. When you say, when I arrive late, I should not participate in the service. Does that mean I must not enter the sanctuary, must not enter the church? Because that's participation in the service. Does this mean I should not sing because I came late? Or does this mean if I'm a preacher, I came just before 11, I should not preach because I came late? Therefore, you can see that here there is ambiguity. Now, what then happens here? The member may still attend and join worship activities. The restriction only applies to leadership roles. Therefore, that could have been what the person who was writing the policy had in mind. All right, this. And therefore, now that the policy is in that way, it simply means that the person who must benefit in the interpretation of that policy, it's the member who comes late. Because the policy is ambiguous, therefore that member cannot be punished. That member cannot be restricted or prohibited to do things because the policy is ambiguous. It's not clear. All right. Now, what is key here? Ambiguous policies are applied to protect the members' rights, not to enforce strict rules when the policy itself is ambiguous. Very key, very important. Let's look at the fourth rule. The fourth rule is the rule of logic. Now here, you're going to notice few things. Here, this rule posits that interpretation is logical. It's logical thinking, and therefore reason must be used in interpreting policy, right? You have logic and you have reason. That is key in this policy. All right. Therefore, policy must be interpreted by applying the laws of language and grammatical analysis so that you pick up the nuances and you pick up various meanings and try and implement and apply the policy. I have an example here. This is the policy. Children under 12 may not serve as ushers. All right. That could be a policy. Children under 12 may not serve as ushers. Now, in this policy, there are a number of things that are not said, okay? And I want you to look at logical interpretation. It is reasonable to allow members 12 years and older to serve. But the policy did not say that. The policy just said children under 12 may not serve. Now, logic says those 12 and above can serve. Then the policy does not prohibit adults or older children from helping. All right. Therefore, there you are actually using logic because the policy is referring to children under 12 who may not be able to serve. Therefore, logically, those who are above 12 and adults can serve. You are using logic in this policy. Therefore, use clear reasoning and language analysis to apply policies sensibly. Let's look at the fifth rule. The fifth rule is the rule of precedence. In this rule, what is important is that it requires the interpreter to check how the same policy is applied in other organizations, all right, sister organizations. The interpreter is expected under this rule to consult with sister organizations to find out how they apply the policy in question and not to reinvent the wheel. Now, I've given an example here. I'm also going to give another example, which I have not put here, so that you understand what we're talking about. The example is departmental leaders must submit reports monthly. Right? That's your policy statement. Departmental leaders must submit reports monthly. Now, you note that your sister churches around you are giving departmental reports quarterly. Now, according to this rule, you must go back to your your drawing board. And there you must say, this rule, in as much as in this church, we would like reports to be done monthly. But other sister churches, all sister churches around us are doing quarterly reports for departments. And therefore, that implementation of policy in other sister churches would influence how you in this particular church is interpreting policy. The other important thing is when it comes to discipline, I'm going to example that you would notice that if someone gets pregnant, all right, therefore the local, the sister churches would take a position to remove that individual from church membership. And yet your particular church was saying, if someone gets pregnant, we censure that person for 6 months. Now you have 6 months that you have in your church, and then the churches around you have 12 months. Have removal from church membership. Now, this rule says I must consult with the churches around. How do you interpret this rule? And if I feel that how they interpret it is unfair, then I need to engage them so that they could actually use what we are doing, because it's actually benchmarking. If we may look at this policy, it's benchmarking. What are they doing there? They are creating a precedence for us. And therefore, it's important to look around and see the precedence that has been created and how you are going to deal with that particular precedence, right? Very important. And key point here, consult how other organizations implement the policy to guide practical and consistent application. And I can always see, and I can almost see that as you are seated there, you are actually saying, hey, this is too much work. How are we going to do all this? Good governance is always hard work. It is not something that you just dream about. As a fact reasonably implied from another fact. In other words, this fact does not stand on its own. It depends on another fact so that it can be interpreted in the right way. Therefore, this rule informs policy interpreters that whatever is inferred to by their policies, although not expressly stated, is, however, equally binding. I want to give an example here so that we follow this, we understand. The example is your policy statement: members must dress modestly during service, right? Now, modestly depends from one culture to the other, because what is modest to me may not be modest in America. What is modest in America may not be modest in Australia. All right? Therefore, modesty, the Bible will always talk about modesty. And therefore, each community interprets that modesty according to its norms and values, right? Therefore, you have this policy statement. How do we interpret this? It says, even though the policy does not list specific clothing items, it implies that revealing or inappropriate attire is not allowed. All right? Revealing or inappropriate attire, because we are using the word modesty, but it does not say your dress must not reveal. It does not say your dress must not be inappropriate. But our interpretation of the word modesty tells us that if I'm modest, I cannot reveal certain parts in my body which may be suggesting. I may not wear a dress that would be inappropriate at church as I'm going to worship there. They were very important inference that the word modesty, then we infer to it, not revealing, we infer to it appropriateness of a dress. All right? The key point here is what can be reasonably inferred from a policy is as binding as what is directly written. All right? Therefore, inappropriate, it's binding that what you are wearing must be appropriate. What you are wearing must not be revealing. But we don't have those words. The word that we have is modesty. Therefore, these are inferred by the word modesty. Right? Let's leave this one and now go to the rule of proportionality, which is another important rule here. The rule of proportionality is required and expected between punishment and the offense. All right? Very important. There is a punishment and there is an offense. Now here, it is a violation of this rule to impose a penalty that is disproportionate in severity to the misconduct that it is intended to cure. Very important that the penalty must be representing the offense that has been committed. Very important. There must be proportionality between these two. I want to give you an example. Here is a policy statement. The policy statement is disruptive behavior during service may lead to disciplinary action, right? That's a policy statement. Now, how do we interpret that in this rule? We are saying if a member whispers during prayer, which is a disruptive behavior. Now, what do we do? There, what we are going to do is to gently remind this person that what he or she is doing, it's inappropriate. Therefore, that's a warning. We are giving that person a warning, reminding that person that what you are doing is inappropriate. We are not going to suspend that person's membership. We are not going to remove that person from membership because whispering during prayer is not proportionate to removal from church membership. I hope this is clear. I'm trying to draw understanding on these two concepts that are in front of us. Penalties must match the seriousness of the misconduct, ensuring fairness and justice. Very key. Let's quickly look at the process of amending or reviewing a church policy. We have a church manual, which I'm going to speak about. How do we review that? We also have our policies that we develop when we sit in our business meetings and develop local policies. How do we review such policies? Now, first of all, the church manual expresses the church's understanding of Christian life and church governance and discipline based on biblical principles and the authority of duly assembled general conference sessions. That's very important. That's a statement that you find in the church manual itself. Right. The church manual, as I've indicated earlier on, is divided into two. You have the mandatory sections, which are your obligatory sections, and it takes 5 years to amend those obligatory parts, right? Now, how do we amend it? I must take you through that process. Now, what happens is we sit at a church in Mbangeni, and in that church, we say there is a problem in the discipline timing. When you censure someone, the church manual says it ranges between 1 month to 12 months, and we are now disciplining this person and censuring him for 6 months. Now, the very same church manual says at the end of that period, then the church must sit and evaluate. Remember, when we say at the end, it means 6 months has ended, and now you're on the 7th month. But the church manual says the church must still sit to evaluate at the end. Therefore, instead of you serving 6 months censure, you are now serving more than 6 months. Therefore, it infringes on your right. And therefore, the church Mbangeni says, no, this policy needs review. All right? Therefore, then the church will then sit in its church board and highlight the area that needs to be reviewed. Then it's taken to the business meeting. The business meeting sends it to the conference. The conference would sit in its executive committee and then look at that policy and then says, no, we are also seeing the same thing. It will send it to the union. Then the union will do the same and look at the policy and say, okay, they will send it to the division. The division executive committee will look at that section and say, let's take it to the committee that has been established to deal with this so that recommendations can be submitted in the next session. Therefore, that's why this policy review would take about 5 years to amend or review a policy, particularly in your mandatory sections, right? Then you have your notes in the manual. Your notes, it's your discretionary part. Those parts that are not mandatory, but are helping us to understand certain things. Therefore, remember, your notes, they can always be looked at by the General Conference, and the General Conference can always give direction in its annual session, in its annual council, your annual executive committee. Therefore, the discretionary one, they can be looked at there, but your mandatory ones are actually amended at a GC session, right? Now, I'm going to give you an example here, which is important. I have your mandatory sections. The church shall celebrate the Lord's Supper at least once each quarter. This is in your church manual. This is a policy statement. The church shall celebrate the Lord's Supper at least once each quarter. This is obligatory. There is no church that is going to say we are not going to celebrate communion quarterly. This is obligatory. Now, let's come to discretion in this particular policy statement. What would be discretionary here? Churches may choose to celebrate communion more frequently if they wish, because the policy statement says at least once a quarter. It does not preclude you having it once a month. It doesn't. Therefore, that's the discretion that is in the policy statement, which is obligatory. Right? The second one is the service may be conducted during a regular worship service or at another suitable time, which could be on a Friday evening or which could be on Sabbath afternoon. The policy does not dictate that. That's discretionary. Very important that you know. Then cultural sensitivity and local church circumstances may be considered in planning the service. Very important. Therefore, you can see the obligatory sections, which are your policy statements. You can see your discretionary sections where you can use your discretion in applying and implementing what is in the mandatory policy. Steps taken to review a policy. I'm going to quickly just run through them. The first one is identify the need for a policy. The second one, consult stakeholders. The third one is draft the proposed amendment. The fifth one is review and feedback. And then the sixth one is approval by the governing body. And then the sixth one, communicate the change. Those are steps that you are taking, identifying the need, consulting stakeholders, drafting the proposed policy, and review and feedback, approval by the governing body, and communicating the change to people when we are reviewing a policy. Right? And then we implement and monitor. Beloved friends, allow me to say effective policies, they guide the church in unity, guide the church in order and fairness. They must be clearly written, they must be consultatively developed, and they must be fairly interpreted. They must be consistently applied. And my final thought to you this evening is that a good policy does not control people. It provides wise guidance that promotes harmony, accountability, and Christ-like leadership in the church. With those words, I want to say thank you, and over to you, either Pastor Munsami or Pastor Ranswabe, for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc, for that presentation. I think it opened a lot of our eyes and understanding, especially the rules to interpretation. But I also like your final thought. Policy is not there to control people. And we pray that God will help us as we continue to serve. At this time, we have around 10 minutes to go. We will take a few hands for questions. Is there anyone who has any questions or reflections? I don't see anything on the chat. Okay, I see one hand, Mr. Gumede.
Siyabonga kakhulu mfundisi ngepresentation ebalulekile kangaka. My question is on the approval of the policy, especially the local church policy. How is it approved? Is it approved by the church board? Is it approved by the business meeting? And in terms of vote, is it a simple majority? And also, does it need to go to the local conference for final approval or for noting? Thank you, Mfundis.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Gwala, just guidance from you. We have two hands. You want to take the two, or you want to answer this question and then take the two?
Let me answer this question,
Okay.
and then I'll take the two. Thank you very much for that question, Brother Gumede. First of all, policies first are discussed at the church board level for recommendation to the business meeting. The business meeting would take a final decision subject to alignment with the policies of the church. In other words, the policies, after they have been adopted by the business meeting, they will be sent to the conference for alignment. And if they are aligning, then the conference will refer them back to you and say, no, we've looked at the policies, they are aligned. Then your church can now continue using that policy. It's voted by the business meeting, subject to alignment. I hope I've answered your question, Mr. Kumede. If there's still something, you can write it on the chat. Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
can.
Yes, we have two hands, Lumka and then Elder Mdakane. Go ahead.
Yes, Lumka.
Seems like there's a network challenge.
Yes, maybe you can start with Brother
Mdakane.
Mtakane.
Elder Mdakane, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got two questions, Dr. Kwala. The first one relates to the working policies for the higher structures. What role does the local church play in terms of influencing those policies? Because I want to believe that when those policies have been formulated, they, to a certain extent, have an effect on the local church. Now, what role do we play as local churches in influencing the either development or amendment of those working policies? That is one. Then the second one, it is my understanding that any policy that is developed has both intended and unintended effects. Now, if you evaluate and discover that there are the unintended effects, cause more damage than what you would have intended, then as a local church, how then do you address that? Because at times we focus more on the intended effects of the policy and to a certain extent ignore the unintended effects of the policies. And we continue to suffer as local churches, suffering from unintended effects whilst promoting the intended effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe I should answer while Lumka is preparing to ask her questions. The first question that you raised is around the working policies. Now, as I've highlighted in, I think yesterday, when I talked about the representative form of governance, which I'm still going to talk more on it, when the conference draws up policies, there are executive committee members, and those executive committee members, almost 50% of the executive committee is members from local churches. Therefore, in that representation, the local churches, they have a direct influence on how those policies will be brought about. If policies will be brought about at the union level, we have members who are from churches that are representing their conferences. They have a direct role of influencing how policies can be reviewed or developed up to general conference. That representation allows us to be able to influence the direction of the policies. Question may be, are we doing it or are we not doing it? That's what we should be looking at. But there is an environment created for us to do it. And if we're not doing it, we need to go back to the drawing board and say, what is it that we can do to influence these policies? The second one, you've mentioned the issue of a policy that is there, and every policy having its intended effect and also unintended effect. It is important that when the church has voted a policy goes through a process of trials. When you are implementing it, you are looking at how this policy is going to assist our organization. I'm going to make an example. Let's say in Pietermaritzburg Church, where I think Brother Mdagana is worshiping. In that church, we take a decision and we say, we are only going to allow members, baptized members of our church to have services in the church when they are conducting a funeral service. In other words, when a member of the church dies, that member is the only person that would be allowed to come to the church and have a funeral service there. Now, when you take that action, in your mind, you have not thought about the children that are not baptized but are coming to church. You have not considered family members who do not have any church out there. Therefore, as you implement this policy, you pick up that there are unintended effects which are very detrimental to the growth of the church. And therefore, the church, once it picks up that, it needs to go back to the drawing board and say, there is an intention here, but this intention, we overlook the unintended effects of the very same policy. And therefore, they would review the policy and factor in both your intention as well as your unintended effects. That's how the church is supposed to deal with these issues. Policies have trial periods, and after that trial period, then you have checked the intentionality of the policy, and then your unintended issues around the policy. And if they are detrimental, then you review. If they are not, the intention is still clear and up there and not disadvantaging members of the church, then you continue with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Lumka, are you able to speak? I see you have opened your mic, but we can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear?
We are hearing.
Good evening, Pastor.
Yes,
Hi,
go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I just wanted a clarity on the issue of the policy application, especially with the issue of membership audits. I understand that the membership audit was primarily done so that the transition to ACMS should reflect the true numbers in our churches, and also for the redemptive membership, where the pastoral has to do a search for the members, and also for financial reasons, and also for compliance. I understand that background, but where I'm having a problem is the issue of a 2-year rule. If, for example, when this policy was initiated, we had members who were already missing or unknown for a period of 5 to 10 years, will we still apply that 2-year rule, or we will then proceed with compliance, whereby the church board will recommend to the business meeting and then vote those people to be on a of unknown or missing. I just needed clarity on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lumka. First of all, the policy provision says that you must do membership audit annually. Therefore, your membership audit is done annually. Secondly, the list of the policy provision on missing members is actually saying if a member is missing for a period more than 2 years. In other words, you can decide when it's over 2 years that you discuss the matter because you do not know the whereabouts. Sometimes you are still looking for the whereabouts. You may be waiting for 3 years, 4 years, you're still checking. But the policy kicks in when you know that the individual has not, the individual's whereabouts have not been known for a period of not less than 2 years. Therefore, that is important. Therefore, the issue of 5 years, it's not in the policy. The policy has 2 years. And the policy is clear. I'm not too sure. You're also mentioning ACMS, whether it was said that you would do that after 5 years. I'm not sure, but knowing ACMS, because I'm one of those who pioneered it in the Cape Conference, it does not have that stipulation, and therefore it's 2 years straight. If a member his whereabouts are not known for a period of more than 2 years, then that member should be recommended to be under a missing list. Thank you. Let me just answer the 2 questions that are on the chat.
Yes.
The first one is what language should be used to write a policy? If your church's official language is Zulu, you write the policy in Zulu. This is Zulu. If your official language is English, you write your policy in English. If your official language is Afrikaans, you write your policy in Afrikaans. Therefore, the church can choose the language of its choice for worship purposes. Therefore, you can use any of the languages that you have chosen. But remember, the conference can only use English because it accommodates all of you. Right, then let's look at the second question. Is there standard timelines for policy review, especially where there is not necessarily a problem with existing one? The risk of lack of this might kill innovation and make the church be reactive instead of being proactive. Thanks. Now, first of all, there is no time frame. Remember, as a church, we know the church manual is reviewed after every 5 years. And therefore, in the local church, remember, policies are reviewed at the end of your term. And therefore, the local church's term is 1 year or 2 years. Therefore, the church might decide that we are going to review our policies once in 2 years or once in 3 years, align them with the conference. Therefore, the local church would decide that. That's point number 1. And point number 2 is that, remember, where the policies, it's important for the local church to actually have a policy and a policy development and review subcommittee that will constantly look at the policies that the church has and make recommendations to the church board for reviewing policies. That will help you a great deal than just doing policies as a by the way thing. It is not in the church manual, but it is not against the church manual to have a committee that is going to be looking at your local policies in the church, and even looking at the church manual itself and looking at areas that need to be reviewed in the church manual. Therefore, that would help a great deal to review policies. Thank you very much. I think
there's one more
concern-
there on the chat.
Say that again, Pastor.
There's one more question on the chat. What happens when the church policy is disregarded when it comes to discipline?
All right. Remember, the church policy itself has an appeal section. If the church is not following the church manual, the member can appeal to the church for hearing that he or she must be heard of the concern he or she has. And if the church refuses to listen to you, the provisions are actually saying you then ask for a leave to appeal to the conference. And if they are refusing that, you write a letter to the conference and you indicate that you've taken this step, it has been refused. You've taken this another step, it has been refused. You are now appealing to them. The conference would write to the church and say, there is this issue. What is happening? And therefore, they would start the process from the conference side. And of course, if it's policy, therefore policy needs to be applied. But the problem that I'm hearing here is that the church is refusing to apply policy. Remember, KNFC has sent a representative to your church, which is a pastor. A pastor is the custodian of the policy. When the pastor is there, he needs to make sure that policy is applied and implemented. And if the policy is not applied, the conference will actually speak to its extension, which is the pastor, and ask why is the policy not implemented? Because the local church is supposed to have the pastor who's going to implement policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc. Appreciate that. It's 7 minutes past. We are gone 7 minutes over our time, and we want to appreciate all the questions and the responses that have come. And thank you, Prof. Gwala, for taking us through this important aspect. I'm going to ask Lulu from Muvongo to close in prayer for us. Lulu, Vongo, are you still there? Okay, they're not there. Mandisa and Kala, are you there? Okay, let us close our eyes as we pray. Our kind of gracious eternal God, we thank you for the opportunity that we could come before you. Thank you for this insightful presentation and exploring our minds to interpret policies within our structure here in KNFC and the local church and the church at large. We pray, dear God, for each and every board member, each and every pastor, and our members, that you will help us to be in line with your governance. Forgive us, Lord, where we have failed thee. Keep us faithful. We ask these mercies in your name. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Amen.
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 Amen.